Eduardo walked hurriedly through Mexico City's Zocalo, ignoring the hustle and bustle and the street vendors trying to get his attention. He was a man with a full agenda, used to closing million-dollar deals, and he had no time for distractions. However, something stopped him in his tracks. A group of children were playing in the corner, barefoot and in worn-out clothes, but that wasn't what had caught their attention. They had his face. Eduardo's heart raced, but not because he was excited. It was more of a mixture of disbelief and bewilderment. He looked at the children again, trying to find a logical explanation. All of them, for in total, shared features that he recognized as his own. The shape of their eyes, the curvature of their nose, even a slight dimple on their right cheek. One of the boys looked up and looked directly at him. For a second, Eduardo felt as if his breath had been ripped out of him. The boy smiled, but that smile did not convey joy. It seemed like a learned smile to hide hunger and fatigue. "Mister, can you help us with some coins?" A feminine voice brought him out of his trance. An older woman, probably in her 60s, approached carrying a bag full of what appeared to be tortillas and beans. The children ran towards her, surrounding her as if she were their only source of protection. Eduardo noticed that his hands were shaking as he opened the bag and distributed the food. "Are they your children?" Eduardo asked without thinking. The woman looked at him strangely, then shook her head. "No, sir. They are my grandchildren, well, almost. I take care of them because no one else does." Eduardo frowned. I felt like there was something more to that story, something that didn't fit. Before he could say anything else, one of the children stepped forward, holding a piece of tortilla in his hand. "Do you want some?" he asked with a disconcerting innocence. Eduardo shook his head, unable to speak. His gaze moved from the boy to the woman and then back to the group. There was something deeply disturbing about that scene, as if fate was playing a cruel joke on him. "Thank you, but I'm fine. What are they called?" he managed to ask. The boy who had offered the omelet laughed, as if the question seemed strange to him. "I am Angel. They are Diego, Luis, and Mateo." The names seemed to fit perfectly with the faces he saw in front of him, as if they were pieces of a puzzle that he still couldn't put together. Eduardo wanted to ask more, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the fear of what he might discover. The woman, noticing his discomfort, tried to apologize. "Sorry if the children bothered you, sir. They're not used to seeing people like you around here." "People like me?" Eduardo repeated, more like a reflex than a genuine question. "People who seem to have it all." The woman's words hit him hard. Eduardo tried to laugh, but the sound caught in his throat. He took a step back, feeling the ground beneath his feet shake. "Where do they live?" The woman hesitated before answering, as if she feared that this information could be used against her. Finally, he pointed toward a set of buildings on the other side of the avenue. "In the camp over there. It's not much, but it's home." Eduardo nodded, although deep down he knew he couldn't leave things like that. He took a couple of bills out of his wallet and extended them to the woman, who accepted them with a mixture of gratitude and embarrassment. "Thank you, sir. God bless him." But Eduardo barely heard those words. His mind was caught in a spiral of questions he didn't know how to answer. Who really were those children? And why did they look so familiar? When he turned to leave, he felt that the eyes of the four little ones were still fixed on his back, as if they were waiting for something more from him. Something I wasn't ready to give them yet. Night came, but Eduardo couldn't sleep. The lights of Mexico City illuminated the room of his luxury hotel, but everything seemed dull, lifeless. In his mind, an image repeated itself. The faces of the four children, identical to his own. He tried to distract himself by checking emails and preparing documents for the next day's meeting, but each attempt ended with him staring out the window, getting lost in the reflection of his own face. Was it possible that these children were more than a coincidence? Eduardo shook his head, trying to convince himself that he was exaggerating. However, the question was still there, growing like a shadow that he couldn't ignore. Finally, he got out of bed and turned on his laptop. He searched local news, hoping to find some information that would help him understand. As he sailed, he remembered something he hadn't thought about in years, a chapter of his life that he had buried along with his origins. As a young man, he had left his hometown of Oaxaca without looking back, convinced that success was only possible if he cut all ties with his past. The memory hit him hard. I hadn't thought about Carmen in over a decade. She was the reason Eduardo almost didn't leave, the only anchor he had considered keeping. But ambition won, and left her with an empty promise to return one day. With a heavy sigh, he closed the laptop. "It can't be," he said to himself, as if those words were enough to silence his conscience. But they weren't. The next morning, instead of heading directly to his meeting, Eduardo took a detour. He walked through the same streets of the Zocalo, looking for something that not even he himself knew how to define. He arrived at the camp that the woman had pointed out the day before, a set of shacks made of wood and sheets, surrounded by garbage and stray dogs. The children were there playing with a deflated ball. Upon seeing him, Angel was the first to run towards him, with that same smile that Eduardo had tried to ignore the night before. "Mister, did he come back to play with us?" Eduardo crouched down, trying to match his height. "I want to talk to your grandmother. Is it here?" Angel nodded, pointing to a shack in the background. Eduardo walked there, feeling the gazes of the other children following him. The woman received him with a mixture of surprise and distrust. "Sir, do you need something?" "I just want to talk," Eduardo responded, trying to sound calm. The woman invited him in, and Eduardo found himself in a small but surprisingly clean space, with old photos framed on the wooden walls. One of the images caught his attention, a young woman holding a baby. He recognized her instantly. It was Carmen. "Where did you get this photo?" he asked, pointing to the frame. The woman sighed, as if preparing for a conversation she had put off for years. It was his mother's. Carmen. Eduardo felt the air become denser, as if each word the woman said was pushing him towards an abyss that he did not want to face. "What happened to her?" he asked, although he was already afraid of the answer. "He died 6 years ago. An accident on the road. Since then I take care of the children." The weight of the information left him speechless. Carmen was dead, and those children were hers. He knew it deep down, even if his mind tried to deny it. The woman looked him straight in the eyes, as if she could read his thoughts. "You are the father, right?" Eduardo opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. For the first time in years, he felt small, vulnerable, as if the entire world had stripped him naked in the face of a truth he could no longer ignore. The woman, receiving no response, continued. "I don't know what kind of man he is now, but if he leaves again, don't come back. These children have lost enough." Eduardo nodded slowly, with a lump in his throat. He looked at the little ones who were playing outside, oblivious to the conversation. At that moment, he understood that his life would never be the same again. Eduardo sat in silence in front of the woman's makeshift table. The cup of coffee she had offered him cooled in his hands as he processed the revelation. Every word he had heard continued to echo in his mind, crumbling the walls he had built to protect himself from his past. From the other side of the door, the laughter of children cut the silence inside the small shack. Eduardo couldn't help but look at them out of the corner of his eye. Every gesture, every smile, was a reflection of him. He didn't need proof to confirm what he already knew. "Did Carmen ever talk about me?" he finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman looked at him, studying him carefully, as if deciding how much he deserved to know. "Yeah, sometimes he talked about you. He said that he was an ambitious man who wanted to change the world. But he also said that one day he would come back for her." The words were like knives, cutting through every excuse Eduardo had used to justify his absence. He lowered his gaze, unable to sustain the intensity of the conversation. I didn't know that she..." The woman interrupted him with a wave of her hand. Tired of the explanations she had probably heard before from other men who had also disappeared. "What matters now is not what I didn't know. What matters is what you will do with what you know." The message was clear. Eduardo looked up and looked at the children again. Angel was showing his deflated ball to a couple of his camp friends, excitedly explaining how it could be repaired. There was a joy in them that did not correspond to the harsh reality that surrounded them. "Do they know who I am?" Eduardo asked, almost fearing the answer. The woman sighed and shook her head. "Not directly, but Carmen kept that photo because she believed that one day you would return. I told them that their father was someone important, someone who loved them. Although, to be honest, there came a time when I didn't even believe in that myself." Eduardo clenched his fists, feeling a mixture of shame and guilt. He had spent the last few years accumulating wealth, seeking validation in the business world, while a part of his life had been abandoned in a corner of the city. I want to do something for them. His voice was firm, although he still doubted his own intentions. The woman looked at him skeptically, crossing her arms over her chest. And what are you going to do? Take them to your world of luxury? Hide them in a big house where they don't have to worry about eating? Eduardo hesitated because he knew he didn't have an immediate answer. The woman's words were a reminder that simple solutions would not be enough to fix years of neglect. Before he could respond, the children ran into the shack, interrupting the tension of the conversation. Angel was carrying something in his hands, wrapped in a dirty cloth. "Look, sir, we found this in the river." Eduardo leaned in to see. It was a pocket watch, rusty and clearly unusable. But the excitement in Angel's eyes made him look like a treasure. "It's old, but it still works a little." Eduardo smiled for the first time in what seemed like years. He took the watch in his hands and examined it. "Did you know? I think we could fix it." The other children approached, excited. Their faces were full of hope, as if a simple watch was enough to change their world. Eduardo felt a weight on his chest, a reminder of what being a father really meant. It wasn't about providing wealth, it was about being present. The woman watched them from the corner, without saying anything. Eduardo knew that he didn't trust him, and with good reason. But he also knew he had a chance to prove to him, and to himself, that he could be more than just a businessman. He looked at the children, holding the watch in his hands. "Tomorrow I will return. Let's figure out how to fix this together." The children clapped excitedly, and Eduardo felt a spark of something he had long forgotten. Something that money had never been able to buy. When he left the shack, the cool night air hit him like a bucket of cold water. He looked up at the stars and took a deep breath. "I didn't know how, but I was determined to find a way to give those kids something truly worthwhile." For the first time in years, Eduardo did not feel like he owned anything, but he did feel responsible for everything. Eduardo spent the night awake, staring at the ceiling of his hotel room as his mind filled with possibilities. What did come back tomorrow mean? What did he really hope to do for those children? For years, his life had been reduced to contracts, figures, and cold objectives. Now he faced a responsibility that could not be measured in money. At dawn, he dressed as meticulously as always, but instead of heading to a business partner's office, he took a taxi to the camp. The streets of Mexico City passed like a blur outside the window, but Eduardo barely noticed them. His thoughts were caught in a whirlwind of doubts. When he arrived, he was greeted by the same childish laughter from the day before. Angel was the first to run towards him, with the rusty watch in his hand. "Mister, are you going to fix it today?" Eduardo smiled, although his mind was still divided. "I plan to, but I also wanted to talk to you." The other children, Diego, Luis, and Mateo, approached with curiosity. They sat around him in a makeshift circle, as if waiting to hear a story. Eduardo swallowed, feeling the weight of the words he was about to say. "I want to help them, but I don't know where to start." Angel frowned, confused. "Help us? We are fine with Grandma." Eduardo felt a knot in his chest. Of course they weren't fine. They lived in a makeshift camp, without access to the basics. But for them, that was their normality, and they didn't seem to realize how much they were missing. "Have you ever thought about going to school?" he asked, trying to sound casual. The children exchanged glances. Finally, Diego responded, "We don't need that. Angel says we are going to be famous musicians one day." Eduardo laughed, surprised by the innocence and determination in her words. But he also felt a pang of sadness. Their dreams were big, but they were limited by the reality around them. The grandmother appeared at the door of the shack, observing the scene cautiously. Eduardo got up and walked towards her, letting the children continue playing. "I need to talk to you." She invited him in, crossing her arms as she looked at him suspiciously. "What do you have in mind now?" Eduardo sighed, struggling to find the right words. "I want to give them a better life. A place where they don't have to worry about the cold or food." The woman raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "And what does that mean to you? Take them away? Separate them from the only thing they know?" The question took him by surprise. In his mind, The idea of removing them from that environment seemed obvious. But now that she said it out loud, he understood the problem. The children not only needed shelter and food, they needed a home, a place where they felt safe and loved. "I don't want to separate them from you," he finally answered, his tone softer. "But I think together we could find a solution." The woman looked at him for a long moment, as if trying to read his true intentions. Finally, he nodded. "If you really want to help them, start by understanding them. They don't need a savior. They need someone who is willing to stay." The words hit him hard. Eduardo nodded slowly, feeling that the woman had just taught him a lesson he would never forget. He left the shack with a new determination. The children continued playing, completely oblivious to the conversation that had just changed the course of their lives. Eduardo approached them and showed them a genuine smile. "You know what? Today we're going to do something different. Let's figure out how to fix that clock, and then we'll go buy some things." The children applauded excitedly, and Eduardo felt that, for the first time, he was taking a step in the right direction. As he accompanied them to the nearest market, he noticed how the curious eyes of the people followed them. No one was saying anything, but it was clear that a man dressed in designer clothing walking with 4 barefoot children was no ordinary scene. Eduardo ignored him. That day it didn't matter what anyone else thought. In a small antique store, the clock found a repairman willing to bring it back to life. Eduardo saw how the children watched the technician's every movement with fascination, as if they were learning a magical secret. When the clock started ticking again, Angel held it up proudly. "It's like new." Eduardo laughed, but deep down, the sound of the clock ticking away was a reminder of something deeper. His time to repair the damage was ticking, and he couldn't waste it. That night, Eduardo returned to the hotel with a different feeling. "For the first time in years, I felt like I had done something meaningful. But I also knew that this was just the beginning. The difficult decisions were yet to come, and he would have to face them with the same determination with which he had built his empire." The following days became an unexpected routine for Eduardo. Every morning, he left the comforts of his hotel behind to walk through the streets full of street vendors and the chaotic traffic of the city. He arrived at the camp early, where the children welcomed him with shouts of excitement and hugs that still surprised him. There was something genuine about her joy, a purity that contrasted with the world of appearances and transactions in which she had lived for so long. The grandmother, however, kept her distance. Although Eduardo noticed that he was watching him from the door of his shack, he never joined the activities that he organized for the children. He understood her wariness. He was a stranger who had arrived from nowhere, promising to help, but with no real guarantee of staying. That morning, Eduardo had arrived with a proposal. She had spent hours talking to lawyers and advisors, exploring legal ways to ensure the children's well-being without separating them from their grandmother. "I knew I would need his approval for any changes I tried to implement. Dona Rosario, can we talk?" he asked, cautiously approaching the shack. She looked at him from the doorway, crossing her arms as she always did when she sized him up. "Speak, but quickly. These children don't take care of themselves." Eduardo smiled with a mixture of nervousness and respect. "I've been thinking about how to help. I don't want to impose myself, much less separate the children from you. But I think we can find a solution together." The woman raised an eyebrow, clearly interested but not letting her guard down. "And what would that solution be?" Eduardo took a deep breath before answering. "A better place to live. Something close to here, where they can still see their friends and you don't have to worry about rent or water. I also want the children to go to school." The silence that followed was almost palpable. The grandmother looked at Eduardo as if trying to gauge the sincerity behind his words. Finally, he sighed and dropped into an old chair by the door. "You talk nice, but I have seen men like you. They come with promises and leave when things get tough." Eduardo felt the words hit him in the chest, but he didn't try to defend himself. Instead, he nodded slowly. "You're right. There is nothing I can say that will show them that I am not like them. But what I can do is stay." Grandma looked at him intently, as if those last words had touched something inside her. "What do you gain from this?" Eduardo took a moment before answering. "Maybe I do it because it's the right thing to do. Maybe I do it because I want to fix the mistakes I made. But more than anything, I do it because they are my family." The silence returned, but this time it wasn't awkward. It was as if something had changed, an invisible barrier began to crumble. "Very good," Grandma finally said, "but if he's going to stay, he's going to have to earn his place here." Eduardo smiled, accepting the challenge implicit in his words. Later that day, he gathered the children and explained the plan. Although they didn't fully understand what it meant to have a new home, their excitement was evident. Angel was the first to speak, with the energy that always characterized him. "Are we going to have a place where it doesn't rain inside?" Eduardo nodded, feeling a lump in his throat. "Yes, Angel, and everyone will have their own bed." The children's eyes lit up at the idea, as if he had promised them the whole world. But for Eduardo, it was not about offering them material things. It was about giving them back something they should never have lost: the security of a home. That night, Eduardo did not return to the hotel. Instead, he accepted his grandmother's invitation to stay at the shack for dinner. It was a simple meal: beans and tortillas, with a little cheese that one of the neighbors had shared. Eduardo ate in silence, watching how the children joked and laughed among themselves. At the end of dinner, Angel came over with a pocket watch they had repaired. "Sir, do you want to keep it?" Eduardo took it carefully, noting how the shiny metal reflected the flickering lights of a nearby candle. "Thank you, Angel, but I believe this watch belongs here, with you. It is a reminder that everything can be fixed if we try." The children nodded, although they didn't seem to fully understand the meaning behind his words. For Eduardo, however, that moment marked the beginning of something much bigger. He had taken a step into the unknown, but for the first time in his life, he felt like he was walking in the right direction. The following weeks marked a visible change in the camp. Eduardo had not only promised to help, but he began to act immediately. The first step was finding a safe place for the family, a space that was not only functional, but gave them a sense of stability. After long conversations with Grandma Rosario, they both agreed that the new home should be close to the camp, so that the children would not lose contact with the friends who had become their second family. A small piece of land on the other side of the avenue turned out to be the perfect option. Eduardo hired a team to build a simple but dignified house. Meanwhile, he insisted on involving the children at every stage of the process. "What color do you want for the walls?" he asked them one day, carrying a painting catalog to the camp. Angel, as always, was the first to respond. "Blue, like the sky when there are no clouds." Diego raised his hand, imitating children in a school. "I want a green wall like the plants we saw in the park." Eduardo couldn't help but smile at their answers. "And how about we make a blue room and a green room?" The children screamed with excitement, and Eduardo made a mental note of their choices. Every decision, no matter how small, helped strengthen the bond between them, but it also reminded him that he still had a long way to go to fully earn her trust. As construction progressed, Eduardo began spending more time with them outside of camp. She took them to the local market, where she taught them how to choose fresh fruits and vegetables and enrolled them in community activities. Although the children were excited, they also faced challenges. "Sir, what happens if the other children don't like us?" Matthew asked one afternoon as they walked back to camp. Eduardo crouched down until he was at her height. "Being yourself will always be enough. And if someone doesn't get it, then they're the ones who are missing out on having amazing friends like you." Mateo nodded, but Eduardo noticed the shadow of insecurity in his eyes. It was a reminder of how much these children had had to face at such a young age. On the other hand, Grandma Rosario continued to be cautious, observing him from a distance, but with less distrust. Although she didn't say it openly, Eduardo could feel that she was beginning to accept his presence. One afternoon, while they were both supervising the construction of the house, Rosario finally broke the silence. "I didn't think it would go this far," he admitted, his tone softer than usual. Eduardo paused for a moment before answering. "Me neither." The woman looked at him curiously, as if this confession revealed something new about him. "What made him change? You don't seem like the kind of man who stops at small things." Eduardo sighed, searching for the right words. "I think I always knew that something was missing in my life, but I didn't know what it was until I saw those kids. They made me remember what really matters." Rosario nodded slowly, as if understanding something Eduardo was still discovering. "They are strong, more than you imagine, but they also need someone who won't abandon them. I hope you were that person." Eduardo did not respond immediately. Instead, he watched the children play soccer on the empty lot next to the construction. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a stranger in his own life. When the house was ready, Eduardo organized a small celebration. He invited the camp neighbors and the children's friends. Although Grandma Rosario was reluctant at first, she finally agreed. On the night of the opening, Angel ran towards Eduardo with a smile that lit up his entire face. "It's the most beautiful house I've ever seen." Eduardo bent down to hug him, feeling a warmth in his chest that he had not experienced in years. "It's your home now, and it always will be." The other children joined in the hug, and in that moment, Eduardo felt that something inside him had been repaired, like the rusty clock they had fixed weeks ago. As laughter filled the air and candlelight illuminated the small patio of the house, Eduardo understood that he had found something that neither money nor success could buy: a purpose. But deep down I knew there were still questions to answer, wounds to heal, and challenges to face. This was just the beginning of a new life, both for the children and for himself. The sound of laughter and light footsteps filled the new house. Children ran through the hallways, excited to explore every corner. Eduardo watched them from the door, with a smile he had not felt before. However, a part of him remained uneasy. Despite the progress, I knew I couldn't ignore the invisible scars those little hearts carried. One day, while helping Angel hang a painting on the wall of his room, the boy asked an unexpected question. "Why didn't you live with us before?" Eduardo's hand, which was holding a nail, stopped in the air. He turned to look into Angel's eyes, filled with a mix of curiosity and sadness. "It's complicated, Angel. I didn't know you guys existed." The boy frowned, as if trying to process that answer. "So, you never wanted to meet us?" Eduardo felt a lump in his throat. This was the kind of conversation I had feared all along. "It's not that I didn't want to, Angel. I made mistakes when I was younger, but now I'm here, and I want to be with you." The boy nodded slowly, but Eduardo knew that his response had not been enough. That night, while the children slept, he sat with Grandma Rosario in the small backyard. The lights of the city flickered in the distance, and the cool air brought temporary relief from the heat of the day. "Angel asked me a question today," Eduardo confessed, breaking the silence. Rosario, who had been mending a shirt, looked up. "What did he tell you?" "I wanted to know why I wasn't with them before." The woman put the shirt aside and sighed. "Don't expect them to understand it right away. It's not easy for them to accept that someone who should have always been there suddenly appears." Eduardo nodded, but his mind was still working on how he could repair something that seemed irreparable. "Do you think they will ever forgive me?" Rosario looked at him with a mixture of hardness and compassion. "Children have big hearts. They can forgive faster than you imagine. But you need to earn their trust day after day. That cannot be achieved with nice words or expensive gifts. It is achieved by being present." Eduardo kept those words like a mantra. The next day, he decided to take the children to a special place, the town where he had grown up. Although the idea filled him with fear, he also felt that it was necessary to face his past if he wanted to build a future with them. The bus ride was long, but the children enjoyed it, watching the changing landscape with fascination. When they arrived, Eduardo felt a wave of nostalgia and guilt wash over him. The dusty streets, the adobe houses, and the familiar faces staring at him in surprise reminded him of how much he had left behind. "Did you live here?" Diego asked, looking around curiously. "Yeah, I grew up here." He took them to a small house on the edge of town, now in ruins. "That was my house," he said, pointing to the structure. The children looked at him in amazement. For them, it was difficult to imagine that the man who now provided them with everything had come from such a humble place. "And what happened?" Louis asked. Eduardo took a deep breath before answering. "I decided to leave to look for a better life. But in doing so, I left important things behind." The children said nothing, but their silence spoke louder than any words. Walking through the town, Eduardo met old acquaintances. Some greeted him warmly, while others looked at him with disdain, reminding him that his departure had not been well received by everyone. Finally, they stopped in front of the town cemetery. Eduardo guided them to a simple tomb, decorated with withered flowers. "Here's Carmen," he said, his voice shaking slightly. The children looked at the grave in silence. Angel was the first to approach, placing a small drawing that he had brought with him. "Hello, Mom." Eduardo's heart sank. He hadn't expected Angel to say something so direct, but at the same time, he felt that this moment was crucial for all of them. As the sun set over the cemetery, Eduardo felt something inside him change. This trip was not only for the children to understand where they came from, it was also for him to accept his own history and reconcile with it. On the way home, the atmosphere on the bus was different. The children seemed calmer, as if something in them had changed too. Eduardo watched them as they fell asleep, one by one, feeling a mixture of hope and responsibility. I knew there was still a lot to do, but for the first time, I felt like they were moving forward together like a true family. The return of the town marked a before and after in Eduardo's dynamic with the children. Although there were still awkward silences and unanswered questions, something had changed. The little ones began to look for him for simple things. Help with schoolwork, questions about how things worked, or simply to share moments of the day. Eduardo saw these small signs as personal victories, but he also knew that the true test of his commitment was yet to come. One afternoon, Angel appeared in the living room with a notebook in his hands and a worried expression. "Mr. Eduardo, can you help me with this?" Eduardo put down the papers he was reviewing and leaned towards the boy. "Of course, Angel. What do you need?" Angel opened the notebook, revealing a sheet full of mathematical equations. "I don't understand how to do this." Eduardo took a pencil and began to explain, but he soon realized that it was not just a problem of understanding. Angel was easily distracted, looking out the window or playing with his pencil. "Angel, are you okay?" he asked softly. The boy nodded, but avoided looking him in the eyes. Eduardo decided not to pressure him. They finished the task together, but he was left with the feeling that something was not right. That night, during dinner, he noticed that Angel barely spoke. While the other children laughed and argued about their games, he kept his head down. "Angel, is something wrong with you?" Rosario asked, frowning. The boy shook his head, but Eduardo was not convinced. After dinner, he decided to talk to Rosario. "Something is bothering Angel. Do you know what it could be?" The woman sighed, putting down the dishes she was washing. "Maybe it's school. Angel has always been a smart child, but he doesn't like to feel less than others." Eduardo frowned, remembering his own childhood. There were times when he had also felt out of place, struggling to prove that he was capable. The next day, he decided to accompany the children to school. It was a small building full of noisy children, with walls barely holding up worn blackboards. When talking to Angel's teacher, she confirmed her suspicions. Angel has potential, but it seems like he has a hard time concentrating. I think sometimes he feels overwhelmed by the pressure. Eduardo decided to talk to Angel after school. She took him to a nearby park, where they sat on a bench under the shade of a tree. "Angel, I want you to tell me the truth. Is school having a hard time for you?" The boy was silent for a moment before nodding slowly. "I'm not as good as the others. Everyone knows more things than me." Eduardo felt a weight in his chest when he heard those words. "I felt that way too when I was a kid," he admitted. "There were days when I thought I would never be good enough. But do you know what helped me?" Angel looked up, curious. "Not giving up? No matter how many times I made mistakes, I always tried to learn from my mistakes. And I didn't do it alone. I always sought help when I needed it." The boy seemed to reflect on his words. "So, it's okay to be wrong?" Eduardo smiled and nodded. "Of course. It's the best way to learn." The next day, Eduardo began to dedicate extra time to Angel, helping him with homework and teaching him techniques to concentrate. He also spoke with Rosario about the possibility of enrolling the children in extracurricular activities that would motivate them. "We don't need them to be the best at everything," he said. "We just want them to be happy while they learn." Rosario nodded, and together they looked for options that might interest them. Angel chose music classes, while Diego and Mateo leaned toward soccer. Over time, Angel began to show more confidence. Although he still made mistakes, he now faced them with a smile. One afternoon, while they were practicing math, Angel looked at him with a serious expression. "Mr. Eduardo, were you ever afraid of failing?" Eduardo paused for a moment before answering. "Many times, Angel, But I learned that fear doesn't go away. The important thing is to move forward despite him. The boy nodded, as if those words gave him a new perspective. That night, as Eduardo watched the sleeping children, he realized that he was facing his own test. It wasn't just about being a good supplier. It was about being there for them, helping them overcome their own challenges while facing your own. For the first time, Eduardo did not feel that he was repairing damage, but rather building something new. Something that would not only change the lives of those children, but also yours. As the days progressed, Eduardo began to feel more integrated into the lives of the children and Rosario. Every little progress he saw in them, like the way Angel was starting to participate more in school, or Diego and Mateo's excitement at coaching soccer, gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't known before. However, along with these achievements, doubts began to arise that tormented him at night. One afternoon, while the children were playing in the yard, Eduardo received a call from a business partner. The man's urgent tone and the implications of what he said brought him back, if only for a few minutes, to the world he had left to be with the children. Eduardo, we need your presence in New York next week. It is a multi-million-dollar contract. We can't close this without you. Eduardo looked at the children from the window. Their laughter filled the air, and for a moment, he felt like he was splitting in two. Let me think about it, he finally responded, cutting off the call before his colleague could insist. That night, Rosario noticed that something was bothering him. What happens now? He asked while pouring a cup of tea for both of them. Eduardo sighed, massaging his temples. They are calling me for an important business in New York. It would only be a few days, but I don't know if I can leave them. Rosario observed him seriously, her gaze fixed on him as if she could read his thoughts. Is it for them or for you? The question took him by surprise. Eduardo looked at her with a frown, as if trying to decipher her meaning. What do you mean? Those children have survived worse things than a few days without you. But you, Eduardo, seem to be struggling with something deeper. Her words resonated with him long after Rosario went to sleep. Was it true? Did her fear of leaving have more to do with her own ghosts than with the children? The decision tormented him for days. In the end, he decided to be honest with the little ones. During dinner, he mustered up the courage to speak. Guys, I need to tell you something. The children stopped eating and looked at him carefully. I have to go away for a few days for work. I promise I'll be back soon. The children's expression changed instantly. Although they tried to hide it, Eduardo noticed the shadow of fear in their eyes. It was Angel who broke the silence. Are you going to leave us? The question, although simple, carried immense weight. Eduardo quickly shook his head. No, Angel, it will only be a few days. Rosario will be with you, and I will be back before you know it. The boy nodded, but Eduardo knew that words would not be enough. He spent the night looking for ways to make sure the children felt safe in his absence. Before leaving, he left notes for each of them in their rooms. Little reminders that he would always be there, just not physically. She also made sure that Rosario had everything she needed to take care of them during those days. The trip was a painful reminder of the life he had left behind. The meetings in glass skyscrapers, the cold conversations about profits and losses, made him feel empty. While his colleagues celebrated the progress on the contract, Eduardo couldn't help but think about the children. The night before returning, he called Rosario to see how they were doing. They're fine, she responded dryly, but Angel has asked about you every day. The words hit him like a hammer. Eduardo ended the call feeling an overwhelming urge to get back. When he finally got home, he found the children playing in the yard. Seeing him, Angel ran towards him, hugging him tightly. I knew you'd come back, he exclaimed, with tears in his eyes. Eduardo hugged him back, feeling a wave of relief wash over him. I will always return, Angel. Always. That night, while they were having dinner, Eduardo made a decision. He knew that his life would never be the same, but he also knew that he did not want to return to the emptiness of before. I'm going to make changes in my job, he told Rosario and the children. I don't want this to be a place I return to. I want it to be the place where I always am. Rosario looked at him, surprised but nodded approvingly. The children did not fully understand his words, but Eduardo knew that in time they would. He had faced his greatest fear, getting lost in the world he had escaped from. Now, He was ready to fully commit to the family he had found. Eduardo's promise resonated in the days that followed. He felt like a new man, but also burdened with the responsibility of fulfilling what he had said. He knew that words were not enough. Children needed constant actions to believe in him. One morning, while helping Diego tie his shoelaces before going to school, the boy blurted out a question that caught him off guard. "Mr. Eduardo, are you going to stay with us forever?" Eduardo paused for a moment, looking into Diego's curious eyes. "That's what I want, Diego. I want to be with you always." The boy nodded with a small smile, but Eduardo could sense the doubt behind his expression. He knew that after so many years of neglect, trust would not be easily gained. That same afternoon, while they were returning from school, they met a group of residents of the camp. One of the men, with hands hardened by work and a face marked by years, approached Eduardo. "So, you are the father of these children?" he asked with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Eduardo nodded, feeling the man's penetrating gaze. "I try that." The man crossed his arms, as if evaluating the sincerity of his words. "It's good that someone cares about them. But remember, children don't need empty promises. They need someone who is willing to stick around, even when things get tough." The man's words stayed with Eduardo as he walked back home with the children. Although he didn't want to admit it, he knew he was right. He had seen too many times how people promised things that they never delivered. She couldn't allow herself to be one more. That night, while the children slept, Eduardo made a decision. He had spent a lot of time trying to balance his new life with the demands of his job. Now it was time to choose. "Rosario," he said as they sat in the small backyard, "I need to talk to you." The woman looked at him curiously, putting aside the shirt she was mending. "What happens now?" "I have decided to reduce my work. I want to be here longer." Rosario raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "And how do you plan to do that?" Eduardo sighed, knowing it wouldn't be easy. "I'm going to delegate more responsibilities to my partners. I still need to work, but I can handle it from here." Rosario observed him in silence, as if evaluating the seriousness of his words. Finally, he nodded. "If that's what you decide, then I hope you do it for the right reasons. These kids need you, but they also need you to be strong for them." Eduardo nodded, feeling the weight of his decision. The next day, he gathered the children and explained to them what he was doing. "From now on, I will spend more time here with you. That means that I will be able to help them more with school, with their activities, and that we will have more moments together." Angel raised his hand as if he were in class. "Will you never have to leave again?" Eduardo smiled, although he knew that the answer was not that simple. "I may have to leave sometimes, but I promise I will always come back. And when I'm here, I'll be here for real." The children nodded, and Eduardo could see a glimmer of hope in their eyes. "I knew that was only the first step, but it was an important one." Over time, Eduardo began to become more involved in the children's daily activities. I accompanied them to their training sessions, attended school meetings, and spent the nights helping them with their homework. He also began to participate more in the community, offering his help to other residents of the camp. One day, while working on a community project to repair a nearby park, one of the neighbors approached. "Looks like he's becoming one of us," he said with a smile. Eduardo laughed, but deep down he felt a warmth that he had not experienced before. For the first time, he didn't feel like an outsider trying to fit in. She felt like she was finally finding her place, not only with the children, but also in the community around them. That night, as he watched the sleeping children, Eduardo felt that something inside him had changed forever. He wasn't just a businessman trying to redeem his past. He was a father, a friend, and an integral part of something much bigger. Although there were still challenges to face, Eduardo knew he was ready for whatever came. Because now, for the first time in his life, he had found a purpose that was truly worthwhile. The days passed with renewed calm. Eduardo felt that little by little the children were beginning to trust him more, and Rosario, although still reserved, seemed more comfortable with his presence. But the tranquility would not last long. As happens in any family, conflicts began to emerge, and with them, the most difficult test for Eduardo. It all started one afternoon, when Diego and Mateo returned from school with gloomy faces. Eduardo immediately noticed that something was wrong. "What happened, guys?" he asked as he put down the papers he was working with. Diego crossed his arms, avoiding looking at him. Mateo, always more direct, blurted out the truth immediately. Some kids at school said we're not really a family, that you are not our dad. Eduardo felt the air become heavier. What exactly did they tell you? Diego finally spoke, his voice shaking. They said that you take care of us because you feel guilty, that we are not his real family, and that sooner or later he will leave. Diego's words fell like a blow. Eduardo saw the tears gathering in the children's eyes, and his heart broke. He knelt in front of them, taking a hand from each of them. Listen to me, guys. You are my family. No matter what anyone says, that will never change. Mateo, still frowning, looked directly at him. So, you're not going to leave us? Eduardo shook his head. Never. No matter what happens, I will always be here for you. But despite his words, Eduardo knew that it was not enough to promise. Children needed to see actions that backed up those promises. That night, while the children slept, Eduardo spoke with Rosario about what happened. This was something that was going to happen sooner or later, the woman said, sighing deeply. Kids have heard things like that all their lives. The difference now is how you decide to deal with it. And how can I help you? Eduardo asked, feeling helpless. Rosario looked at him intently. If you want them to see you as their family, you have to show them that you are not only here to save them, but to walk alongside them. The next day, Eduardo decided to do something special. He asked the children to accompany him to a place that was important to him. They got into the car, full of curiosity, and after a long drive, they arrived at a mechanical workshop. What is this place? Angel asked, looking around. Eduardo smiled, pointing to a small rusty plaque next to the entrance. This was my father's workshop. I learned a lot of things here when I was a child. The children looked at Eduardo with surprise. He didn't usually talk much about his past, so this moment felt different. They entered the workshop, where some old tools and a worn workbench were still preserved. Eduardo knelt in front of them, taking out a wooden box that he had kept for years. I want to show you something, he said as he opened the box, revealing an album of old photos. The children approached, observing the images with fascination. There were photos of Eduardo as a child, working alongside his father. My father always told me something that I never forgot. A family is not measured by blood, but by the hands that are willing to pick you up when you fall. Angel pointed to one of the photos. Is that your dad? Eduardo nodded, feeling a lump in his throat. Yeah, he taught me what it means to care for someone, and that's what I want to do for you. The children remained silent for a moment before Mateo spoke. So, are we like you and your dad? Eduardo smiled, placing a hand on Mateo's shoulder. Exactly. The rest of the day was spent exploring the workshop and listening to Eduardo's stories. When they returned home, the children seemed calmer, as if something in them had changed. That night, while Eduardo tucked them in, Angel stared at him before speaking. Do you know what, Mr. Eduardo? I think you are our dad now. Eduardo felt his eyes fill with tears, but he managed to maintain his composure. I always have been Angel. We just needed to realize it together. When the children finally fell asleep, Eduardo sat on the small couch in the living room, letting the emotion wash over him. He had faced one of his toughest tests yet, but he felt like he was one step closer to building the home he had always dreamed of for them. The following weeks were a reflection of everything Eduardo had learned about family. The days were filled with small victories. Angel finished his tasks with fewer doubts. Diego and Mateo spoke enthusiastically about their training, and even Rosario seemed more open, allowing Eduardo to share responsibilities that he previously assumed alone. But despite the progress, there were still times when the shadows of the past tried to infiltrate their new reality. One day, while cleaning out an old closet in the nursery, Eduardo found a box he had not seen before. Inside there were children's drawings, crumpled papers, and, in the background, a photo of Carmen. It was a simple image of her smiling in a light dress in the sun. Eduardo felt a lump in his throat. Do you miss her? A voice asked behind him. He turned to see Angel at the door, with a serious expression he rarely showed. Yes, Angel. I miss her a lot. The boy entered slowly and sat next to Eduardo. I don't remember her well, but Grandma always says she was very good. Eduardo nodded, looking at the photo carefully. It was incredible. and I know I would be very proud of you." Angel was silent for a moment before speaking again. "Do you think she would be mad at you?" Eduardo looked up, surprised by the question. "Why do you say that?" "Because you left. Grandma always says that you were looking for something far away, but why didn't you stay?" The weight of guilt fell on Eduardo like never before. It was a question he had asked himself many times, but hearing it from Angel was different. "Angel, when I left, I thought I was doing the right thing. But now I know I was wrong. I can't change the past, but I can make sure I'm here for you now." Angel nodded slowly, as if processing the words. "So, you're never going to leave again?" Eduardo placed a hand on Angel's shoulder, looking him directly in the eyes. "Never, Angel. This is my house now. You are my family." The boy smiled, and Eduardo felt that, for the first time, he had said exactly what they needed to hear. Later that night, he gathered everyone in the room. Rosario watched him curiously as the children settled around him. Eduardo took a deep breath before speaking. "I want to share something with you." He took out the photo of Carmen that he had found and placed it on the table. "This is his mother. She was a strong and brave woman, and I want you to know that everything I do now is to honor her and you." The children looked at the photo carefully, as if trying to absorb every detail. "From now on, I want us to do something together as a family," Eduardo continued. "Each week, we will remember the good things we have, the things we are grateful for, because that's what makes us strong. Staying united, no matter what happens." Rosario smiled from her spot in the corner, nodding silently. The children accepted the idea with enthusiasm, and that same night, they began their first family tradition. Each one shared something for which they were grateful. Angel was the first to speak. "I'm grateful because now we have a dad." Diego and Mateo followed him, mentioning simple but significant things. Having a house where it didn't rain inside, being able to play soccer with new shoes, and the stories that Eduardo told them at night. When Eduardo's turn came, he looked at the children and Rosario before speaking. "I am grateful because you gave me a second chance, an opportunity to learn what it really means to be family." That night, when everyone went to sleep, Eduardo stayed in the living room for a moment, looking at Carmen's photo. "Although I knew I could never change what had happened, I also knew I was doing my best to build something new." In the following days, Eduardo and the children continued to strengthen their bond. There were challenges, of course, but there were also moments that filled him with joy. The laughter during meals, the unexpected hugs, and the small but powerful displays of affection that emerged every day. Over time, Eduardo began to realize something he had never understood before. It wasn't about being perfect or having all the answers. It was about being present, about showing the kids that they could always count on him, even when things got tough. One afternoon, while they were walking together in the park, Angel took Eduardo's hand without saying anything. That simple gesture was enough for Eduardo to understand that he was where he had always belonged, in the heart of his family. Finally, he had found his place. It wasn't in business meetings or multi-million-dollar contracts. It was here, between childish laughter and warm hugs, building a future with the children and Rosario. The journey had not been easy, but every step was worth it, because now he knew that true wealth was not in what he had accumulated, but in the lives he had touched. And for the first time in a long time, Eduardo felt complete. This story teaches us that no matter how far we have gone or how much we have failed, there is always an opportunity to redeem ourselves and build something new. The family is not always the one that gives us life, but rather the one that we decide to care for and protect. Now we invite you to reflect. What would you do to avoid losing what is most important? If this story touched your heart, leave us your comments. We want to know your opinion. Subscribe for more stories that will make you feel and think. And don't forget to share this message with those you love most. Click now on the final screen and get ready to discover a new story that will excite you even more. Don't miss it.